Let's look at how to control shadows, specifically for any renderer other than ART. We have some choices about our shadows. I've reset 3ds Max, and I want to open up the scene file for this movie to illustrate that we're going to get a pop-up dialog asking about gamma correction. I'll go to File, Open, and navigate to 1603 Controlling Shadows, and click Open. And I get a dialog warning me that there's a mismatch between the gamma settings of 3ds Max and the incoming scene file. The scene file has gamma disabled. 3ds Max basically always has gamma enabled now. This has changed in the most recent versions of 3ds Max. When you reset the program or close it and reopen it, gamma correction will always be enabled. Down here, we can choose to, for the current session, either keep the existing setting, which means to enable gamma, or to adopt the incoming file. In this case, I want to adopt the incoming file so that gamma will be disabled for the standard lights. Let's now work with shadows. Shadows are disabled on lights by default. If I select the spotlight, go to the Modify panel, we can see that shadows are turned off. If you're using the ART renderer, shadows will always render regardless of the state of this switch. But for every other renderer, you have the choice of enabling or disabling shadows. And when it's off, then you won't get shadows, obviously. I'll right-click on this physical camera panel and then do a quick scanline render. And when that completes, we will see that it's not a very realistic rendering because there are no shadows anywhere. I'll enable the shadows and then re-render to see what it looks like with default shadow properties. Before we do, let me just mention that we have different options here for types of shadows. In this pull-down list, you'll see that there are multiple options. The one I want to look at here is actually the default, which is Shadow Map, and that's a pixel-based projection. It's a very fast rendering shadow because what it's doing is it's projecting an image from the point of view of the light, and we can control the quality by setting the resolution. And that's a shadow map, or sometimes known as a depth map shadow. These other ones here, Advanced Ray Trace, Area Shadows, and Ray Traced, those apply to the scanline renderer, and those use a vector-based solution, and the quality of the shadow will be determined by parameters such as the radius of the light. But let's look at shadow maps because that's really the most important one because it's the one that will give us the most performance benefit. It will render the most quickly in the scanline renderer. Let's render this with default shadow map properties. Click on Render. And now we've got default shadow mapped shadows. And it looks okay. We got a soft shadow here. Notice that it's uniformly soft. It's not really physically accurate. In the real world, the shadow would be crisper here, where those two surfaces are closer together, and it would be softer out here. We don't have the ability to achieve that effect with shadow maps. But we can control the quality of the shadow globally. And let's scroll down in our panel here, in the Modify panel, and we've got shadow parameters, and that's generic to all of the shadows for the scanline renderer. We can control the color of shadows and also the density or opacity. I'm going to leave those at their defaults. We want to focus on the shadow map parameters. Open that up, and we have three main parameters here. The size is the resolution or the quality of the projected bitmap. Sample range is a blur factor, and that's how we're getting the soft shadows here. And bias allows you to move the shadow towards or away from the light. Sometimes you might have a situation where the shadow will not appear on the surface, and you can correct that by adjusting the bias. Let's play around with some of these parameters. And the best illustration of how this works is to set the sample range down to its minimum of 0 or nearly 0. I'll type in a 0 and it goes down to 0.01. And additionally, change the coverage or area of the light. For a spotlight, we could make it cover a larger area either by moving the light away from the subject or by changing the fall-off radius. Let's do it by changing the fall-off radius. Remember that we have a hot spot, which is the brightest area where we have full illumination here, and then it will diminish in intensity until it reaches that fall-off radius here. I'll scroll back up into the spotlight parameters and increase the fall-off radius quite a lot up to a value of, let's say, 140 or so. And now it's covering a lot larger area, and also the shadow is covering a larger area. Our 512 by 512 pixel shadow map is now being spread across a very large area in the scene. And we'll do another test render of that. And as we can see now, the pixels of the shadow are very, very obvious. And that's because I reduced the sample range down to nearly 0 in order to make my point. If I did want to have a very large coverage to the spotlight, or if I was trying to project a shadow map from an omni light, which is an omnidirectional light that shines equally in all directions, in those cases, if I wanted good shadows, then I would need to set these values appropriately. I'll put the sample range back to its default of 4 and do a render of that just to show you that what we'll get is very large pixels that are very blurry. And this is the sort of thing that happens a lot with shadow maps if you're not really paying attention to the size or resolution, is you'll get these kind of weird shadows that don't look right at all. They have this kind of squarish appearance here. And it's because we have these super large pixels that have been blurred. To get good results in this situation with a large radius to the fall off for the spotlight, let's increase the size or resolution. And in order to conserve memory, your best practice is to use powers of 2, 512, 1024, and so on. I'll turn this up to a 4K image, which is 4096 pixels on a side. Press the Enter key, and then do a test render. All right, cool. Now we've tamed our shadow maps. We've increased the radius of the spotlight, and then we've corrected by increasing the size of the shadow maps. So that's how we can control shadow maps, and that is very important for any renderer other than ART.